Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for being here today. As Lisa Romero mentioned, my name is Alma Flores, and I'm an assistant professor here in the College of Education at Sac State. I want to thank Dr. Lisa Romero, as well as Dr. Basia Ellis and the rest of the ERI committee for the opportunity to present on this work. I want to also acknowledge and honor the Nisenan people whose land I'm privileged to live in and work in. And lastly, I do want to just take a moment to recognize the anger, the pain, the frustration, the sadness that we may all be carrying today from the recent domestic terrorist hate crime on the Asian American Pacific Islander community. I'm holding you all tight. I stand with you. The title of my presentation is a Chicana-Latina Feminist Methodology, examining Platicas in educational research. I do want to just preface that when the ERI committee reached out to me about putting this workshop together, it was pre-pandemic, so I had envisioned something definitely a lot more collaborative and interactive. But like with everything in my life right now, we're just gonna roll with it and do our best. Let's see. What's happening? All right, so the presentation is organized in the following work. I'm gonna start by just talking about how I came to know Platicas and what Platicas are. And then, as Dr. Lisa Romero pointed out, the presentation is really guided by these 4 questions. So what are Platicas? What are their origins? What is the role of positionality in Platicas? What do Platicas look like in research and practice? And then what are some future directions of Platicas in education? And then I'm hoping we have some time for some Q&A. And so to begin with this question of what are Platicas, I want to share how I came to know Platicas. Now, for my non-Spanish speakers, Platicas very loosely translates to informal conversations. And I say very loosely because I would argue that there isn't necessarily a direct translation from Spanish to English. I would say that it's similar to the word educación, which doesn't necessarily translate exactly to education. I think Platicas is also one of those words that doesn't have a very direct English translation because they are much more than just informal conversations. So to talk about how I came to know Platicas, I'm going to use the artwork of Carmen Lomas Garza to explain again the role Platicas have played in my life. So for me, Platicas are really a cultural practice, but more specifically, they are a womanist or mujerista practice. They are also very much intergenerational. I grew up seeing my mother, my abuelitas, my tias, and other women in the family gather in the kitchen table para platicar, similar to image 1 here. They would talk about family gossip, chisme. They would give consejos, advice. They would share remedies, and sometimes even regañadas, scoldings. And I have these very distinct memories of growing up, kind of peering over the kitchen table, listening and watching them and seeing their laughter, their joy, sometimes tears, sometimes remorse. But also I witnessed them talk about their dreams and their hopes for themselves and their families. Platicas also took place at family parties, similar to image 2 here, during carne asadas, cookouts, where family would come together, during piñatas and other celebrations, quinceañeras, family parties, etc. And then Platicas can also take place in groups, but also in smaller one-on-one dyads. And so I have very distinct memories also of Abuelito Bolo and his stories and how he would platicar with his own grandchildren, similar to image 3 here, all his grandchildren would kind of sit around him, and he would talk to us about crossing the border, his life in Mexico, in the rancho, all the jobs he worked before he came to the US. And so platicar again was a very familial thing for me. As I got older and I left to college, I would say that Platicas became even more central in my life. As a first generation college student, the Platicas with my peers who were also from similar backgrounds really sustained me. It gave us the space to feel recognized and acknowledged. Similar to image 4 here, right? With my colegas, amigas, comadres, we would kind of just sit around and talk about our days. And now more than ever, as a professor and mother, Platicas have continued to sustain me, whether it's the just checking in text message from colegas, that group text message that I'm sure we all have, where we are lifting each other up, affirming our very real experiences with racism, sexism, and other oppression that many historically marginalized groups face in academia. But also, when I think about my work in academia, Platicas are also the way I theorized, I organized with my colegas. There are spaces of theorization where we workshop ideas, papers, and research projects. So in short, Platicas have really sustained me culturally, personally, and professionally. So now that you know a bit about my own relationship with Platicas, I want to provide you a genealogy of Platicas in academia. But before doing this, I do want to very much acknowledge that this work is collaborative. What I'm about to present is partly based on a forthcoming publication that I have with Dr. Socorro Morales, and also with a special issue that I'm working with Dr. Tania Gaxiola Serrano and Dr. Dolores Delgado Bernal. So all to say is that I cannot take full credit for this work. This is work that's been in the making in Platicas that we have been engaging in. So when we look at Platicas in academia, we see that they begin to emerge in the late 1970s. As I've spoke to, right, they've existed in the community for many generations, but Platicas in academia, at least the use of them, we begin to see them in the late 1970s. And what my colegas and I have done is we traced how they have been used in academia. And we found that they've been used in these 3 specific trajectories. So the first trajectory really comes from the field of counseling and psychology, where we see Platicas used as a gateway to the data. That comes from this culturally familiar place of engagement with primarily the Latinx community or families. So Platicas in this sense are the entryway to the actual data collection. They are not the data tool. So here's an example. This is an article from Health and Social Work, 1995, from Stephen Lozano Applewhite. And so they used a Platica methodology. They refer to it as a friendly, informal conversation. And they say this approach is well suited to elderly Mexican Americans because it enables researchers to first establish a sense of confidence, trust, and mutual holistic sharing, critical concepts in the culture, before moving towards task-oriented activities. And that last piece is really important, right? Before moving toward task-oriented activities. So again, it's the entryway to the data collection. It's not the way of collecting data. The second strand that we were able to kind of tease out is by mostly Chicanx or Latinx scholars that have used Platicas to describe the cultural nuances of engaging and conversing with Chicanx or Latinx families. So this comes from Guajardo and Guajardo, 2 brother scholars who also use Platicas. And so they say We tap Platica as a chief modality for our work because it makes sense to us culturally, politically, ontologically, and epistemologically. It is at the root of how we work and live our lives. We learned Platica, an expressive cultural form shaped by listening, inquiry, storytelling, and story making that is akin to nuanced multidimensional conversation from our parents Angel and Julia. And so again, it's this tool to describe the cultural nuances of talking with Chicanx and Latinx families. And then lastly, we see it being used largely by Chicana Latina feminists who are drawing from Black, Indigenous people of color or women of color frameworks that again center kitchen table talk as healing and necessary in fighting against white supremacy. So this comes from Cynthia Saavedra and her colleague Perez. And they say, through Platicas, we honor the meaning making that transpires in everyday and mundane conversations and exchanges between mothers and daughters, teacher and students and colegas, to name a few, that yield conocimiento. This conocimiento comes from collective dialogue and inevitably challenges the impersonal and clinical methodologies that saturate even critically conceived research designs. Instead, we center the theorizing that happens at the kitchen table, over coffee and in encounters between people. So again, we begin to see a shift here in how Platicas are being utilized. And so again, to review, initially we see Platicas in academia, the gateway to the research, the entrada. Then we see them used as a cultural practice when engaging the Latinx community. And then Platicas as a Chicana Latina feminist theorizing space that can be healing and reciprocal. And really, this is where our work comes from and where this presentation or workshop centers. And this work is informed by other Chicana Latina queer feminist scholars, women like Sherry Moraga, Gloria Ansaldúa, and some of these other texts where arguably they're using Platicas. So again, this presentation situates itself in this last strands with the desire again to highlight how scholars use this methodology and articulate its connection to BIPOC women and their theorizations of oppression and resistance. So to recap, what are Chicana Latina Feminist Platicas? And I do want to make a distinction here is that the way we're situating this is that we see a difference between Platicas and Chicana Latina Feminist Platicas. And so the focus of this presentation is Chicana Latina Feminist Platicas. So as I mentioned, historically, this has existed in the community for generations. This didn't come from academia. This came from communities. Methodologically, they are similar to other critical theories and methodological approaches that, again, have legitimacy in community spaces, but are or were not given legitimacy in academic spaces or settings. They're rooted in Chicana Latina feminist cultural practices that, again, deem everyday spaces as grounds for theorizing. They are both methodology and method. So the way I or my colegas and I understand methodology is the way we approach the research that we do. It is informed by systems of knowing, what we refer to as epistemology, and method is the specific tools that we use to collect our data. And so we situate Platicas as both a methodology and method. So they can be a tool for collecting data, but they're also a methodology because they're very much grounded in Chicana Latina feminist theory. They can be used individually or in group settings. And again, they take place in the everyday and do not necessarily always follow a set script. But again, they can take the form of chisme, of dichos, cuentos, or other forms of oral storytelling. So I want to point out to this specific article. So in 2016, Cindy Fierros and Dolores Delgado Bernal published this piece in the MALCS journal, Vamos a Platicar. And this article specifically really changed the conversation on how Platicas were used in educational research by, again, shifting them from just simple entryways or small talk to an actual valid methodological approach. And this article is really significant because much of the work prior to this article focused on how Chicana Latina feminists engage with one another in Platicas, but not necessarily how they move this practice to research or methodology with various populations or communities. So in their article, they outline 5 contours. So they say that Platicas view and honor participants as co-constructors of knowledge. They incorporate everyday lived experiences as part of the research inquiry. They are two-directional and based on reciprocity, vulnerability, and researcher reflexivity. They can provide a potential space for healing. And then again, they draw heavily from Chicana Latina feminist theory. So this is a question we often hear when we are presenting or talking about Platicas. So how are they different from interviews or semi-structured interviews? I think at the core, Platicas really question and challenge this idea of objectivity within research. I think we know that for decades, scholars of color, specifically women of color, have noted how Eurocentric epistemologies of research consistently prize this idea of objectivity, even though it is entirely unrealistic to attain. Using Platicas brings to the forefront this notion of, quote, a leading question. That is, when a researcher is leading a participant to respond in a certain way, or they're seeking a particular response, rather than, quote unquote, having a genuine response. But Platicas, again, they're not concerned with this idea of objectivity or leading questions because they're not informed by Eurocentric ways of knowing. They are informed by Chicana Latina feminist ways of knowing. Instead, they center reciprocal dialogue where the researcher is not just asking questions and waiting for a response, but rather the is actively engaged in the conversation, sharing vulnerabilities and reflections. So why does positionality matter in Platicas? And we address this question because often we'll get questions like, well, can non-Chicana Latinas use Platicas? Or can men use Platicas? And we always point to this concept of positionality, right? I think you need to engage your positionality and why you're interested in using this methodology. So a Platica methodology therefore begins by examining our positionality, which is the assumptions, the life experiences and values that really guide how we approach the research process. So before we can engage in any Platica, we have to look inward and really critically assess our identities, our race, ethnicity, class, etc., and how they are tied to systems of power and oppression, because our positionality can help us better understand or connect with our research collaborators or research participants, but it can also lead to oversights or confusion. And this is why it's important to practice this idea of researcher reflexivity, so we can acknowledge how our privilege in relation to our research collaborators is present and work through those misinterpretations as well. So what do they look like in practice? So I would like to give you an example using the story of Connie and Blanca, who are this mother-daughter, and it comes from NPR Story Corps. It's a podcast. So I'm going to show you the video, and I want you to pay attention to the Connie, who is the daughter, and Blanca are engaging with one another. What feelings are expressed? Could we argue that the Platica they are engaging in is data? Data perhaps about the role mothers play in Latinas' educational aspirations, or even data about how we understand Latinx parent involvement. So let me go ahead. I'm going to show it on YouTube so that it's captioned. So give me a second while I pull that up. Let's see. All right. So I'm gonna make this big. Hopefully this works.
What kinds of jobs did you have since first arriving in the country?
We were gardeners, and we were cleaning offices.
I remember the offices.
You remember that? We had the night shift cleaning. That's why, we had to take you and your brother. I didn't have a babysitter.
I have memories of running into everyone's office and eating candy from their candy dishes. I remember being with my brother in our pajamas with the little plastic feet. And I also remember you would always buy us a cup of noodle from the vending machine, right? Like a snack, and then put us to bed on people's office couches, and then you'd carry us to the car when you guys were done cleaning the offices. I remember that. Did they ever know? Did your bosses ever know that you took your kids?
No, I don't think so.
Is there anything that you've never told me but want to tell me now?
When we first came here, we went through a lot of things like not eating. I guess for 6 months your father lost his job, and we never told you that.
I do remember a lot of bean tacos.
But when you ask us why the same thing, remember?
Yeah.
I didn't want to tell you why.
Yeah. If you could do everything again, would you raise me differently?
I would dedicate more time, I guess. I was so busy going to school too that I guess I neglected you a little bit.
No, for me, watching you go to school with 2 kids and trying to make ends meet, that was the biggest inspiration for me to finish college. I thought there's nothing that could stand in my way that didn't stand in yours more. It's the most important thing for me, having gone to college, and I feel like anything I do from here on out is okay because I've already achieved my dream. Everything else is icing on the cake.
What's that? Okay, so again, that was Connie and Blanca. Give me a second to get back to my presentation. All right. So again, what kind of feelings emerged in their plática? Could we argue again that the plática they were engaging is data about the role mothers play in Latinas' educational aspirations, or even data about how we understand Latinx parent involvement? So I don't know, Lisa, I'm okay, there's 56 participants. So perhaps instead of doing breakout groups, because I feel like that might be a little stressful, we can take a moment and think about these following questions. So if you grew up being familiar with the term pláticas, can you share how you understood it within your own family or home or community spaces? Was it connected to how you learned different forms of knowledge via your family? If so, how? So maybe what we can do is I'll post the questions. I'll give us some time to kind of gather our thoughts. And then when you're ready and if you're comfortable, if you can put your response to the chat and make sure you include the number of the question so I know which question you're addressing. Question 2, can you identify any of the 5 contours from Fierros and Delgado Bernal article, or other elements of a Chicana Latina feminist Platica methodology in Blanca and Connie's Platica? And then number 3, are there ways you could incorporate a Platica methodology in your research? If so, how? So what I'll do instead, I'm going to exit here. I'm going to actually drop a link in the chat where the discussion questions are, as well as some resources. So let me go ahead and do that. All right, and everyone should be able to access that. And I will share my screen again. So let's take a couple minutes and think about these questions. And like I said, when you're ready, if you're comfortable, if you want to put it in the chat, and maybe we can hear from a few people. Thank you for sharing, Marta. Others? All right. Thank you, Angela. Yeah, many of us, right? We've had platicas, whether it was with our own family members or with the folks we work with. Thank you, Leah. Yeah, Jessica, absolutely, right? This healing piece of platicas. Yeah, Pepe, for sure. Thank you, Isamar. Thanks, Kate. Yeah, absolutely. All right. I'm gonna give folks maybe 2 more minutes. Thank you, Italia. Thanks, Veronica. Yeah, thanks, Gabi. Thanks, Kate. Yeah, so I'm seeing how some of us can really relate to platicas as something we saw in our homes or in our own families, but even also with the folks we're working with, whether it be via research or our own professional lives. Yeah, thanks, Jessica. Thanks, Leah. Yeah, Luis, for sure. Yeah, yeah. So I hope that that piece from Connie and Blanca kind of helped you see what they can look like. I want to give you one more example, and this example actually comes from my own research with mothers and daughters. And so to do this, I'm actually going to ask Dr. Romero and Dr. Ellis if they could help me out. I'm going to drop a link in the Google chat. And if possible, if everyone can access this, they can follow along. And so what you're going to be looking at is an actual transcript from my own research with Chicana Latina mothers and daughters. So give me a second while everyone kind of looks like. So yeah, in 2016, I conducted a study that examined the role of immigrant mothers and what role they play in the success of their first generation college daughters. And very similar to Connie and Blanca, I conducted most of these platicas in the mother's kitchen tables. And although the majority of the platicas did focus on education, we also talked about patriarchy, sexism, other forms of oppression that Latinas Chicanas face. And so this following excerpt that you're looking at in the Google Doc comes from a mother-daughter platica with Chata, who is the mother, and Quetzali, who is her daughter. And so again, I'm going to ask Dr. Romero if she can read Chata's lines, and Dr. Ellis if she can read Quetzali's lines. Is that okay?
Yes, absolutely.
So let me go ahead and share my screen, and then I will walk you through again what elements or what makes this a plática. All right, so again, Chata is the mother of Quetzali, and Chata and Quetzali are my research collaborators or participants, and I'm the researcher. Okay, so I will start. So I noticed that you both talked about marriage in a very interesting way. This has also come up with other moms. So from what I gathered, marriage was talked about either as a sort of escape from poverty or something that could prevent us from pursuing our education. It's really interesting because that really fits my mom's narrative, in that for her, marriage became an escape too. But it was also what prevented her from like pursuing education.
Okay, so I'm going to now be Chata, correct?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I wanted to start because of what you said about your mom. I can relate to that. I do feel like it was an escape because I was only 18 and I did want to get out of my house.
Yeah, that was my mom too. She was 18.
And I thought that I was in love and I did want to get out, but not realizing that actually getting married brings a lot of responsibilities and you totally lose yourself. At least for me, I lost myself and all of a sudden my goals and my dreams were gone. I didn't have those anymore. Now I had to focus on a family and having a child. I felt like that just came along with being married. I didn't feel like I had a real choice to say, no, I don't really want this. So that was not a good thing for me. And I've always told my daughters that I didn't want them to get married young, and praise the Lord they didn't.
So we all laugh.
Quetzali says, I was so freaked out after hearing all that. I didn't want to get married at all.
But you are all so removed from that.
Yes and no. As I shared how my extended family has reacted about my engagement, they're also thrilled. And I mean, I am too, and I understand them, but sometimes I'm like, damn, I wish you were all this excited about my schooling. Like I've accomplished all these other cool things, but we don't really celebrate that like marriage.
Yes, Quetzali has talked about how she's trying to combine her, she's trying to continue her dissertation, but she has all these other pressures with the baby and the husband and the family and the obligations that comes with them.
I think we talked about how when we look at the Chicano pipeline, there's maybe like number one that gets a PhD and you just want to run through the pipeline without looking back. And that's how I felt. I know I have choices and I can choose to get married or not, but after my mom's story, I feel like somehow it was going to get me. So I was scared, like somehow I am just going to fall into it, just like how she did. I'm going to get married and then have kids, and I haven't finished my degrees, so I didn't take any breaks.
I start tearing. Yeah, I totally hear you. I felt like that too.
So I ran through all those degrees, no marriage, got to the very end. And then I was like, I am getting too old. I want a baby and the pressures, and it's expected of you. And why don't you have any kids? So there's that tension. This is what I want. And I ran through all these degrees, but there's these expectations of society and family and culture has, and I want that too. I want to have a family and a legacy and teach my daughter what my mom taught me. So I've made it to the very end, and now I am struggling. And starts crying again.
So at this point, all of us are crying, and I decide to just take a break and kind of sit with our emotions. So again, this is so I conducted Platicas with mothers and daughters, and this is an excerpt from one of those Platicas with a mother and daughter. So I want to kind of walk you through how this is a Platica. So let me show you. All right. So, oops. Sorry, folks, don't know what's happening. Let's see. Let's see. Oh my goodness, sorry, folks. Okay. All right, so in this Platica, I want to highlight the following three things. So I want to highlight my role as the researcher, and you can look at the transcript again if you need to. But you'll note that in this Platica with Chata and Quetzali, I'm just as engaged as they are. I'm making connections to my own personal experiences, and I'm really also allowing my own feelings to emerge in the exchange, whether it's laughter, joy, or sadness. For example, when I start the Platica, I start by sharing a bit of my own mother's story. And I think this creates an inviting space for Chata to also be vulnerable and share her own nuptial experiences. This differs from a traditional interview protocol that praises objectivity. Through this frame, my comments would be considered leading to the participant or almost biased, since I am also sharing preliminary findings of the data, as well as personal experiences with Chata and Quetzali. And in Platicas, the conversation is fluid. Sometimes it's strong, other times it's messy. But there's no restrictions on what can or cannot be discussed or how the research contributes to the conversation. The Platica also created a space of trust with one another. I think we felt comfortable enough to cry in front of each other. Quetzali in particular gets emotional at various points. And I kept a research journal throughout this study. And later I would actually write about how much I saw myself reflected in Quetzali. It was very much this experience of almost looking in a mirror. Because like her, my mother's marital experiences really led to this fear of getting married young and missing out on an education. Because similar to Chata, my mom had that experience as well, married very young and was not able to pursue her own dreams of higher ed. And so this moment of connection with Quetzali became both a moment of theorization, but also healing for me. I think it helped me begin to unpack the ways I had internalized heteropatriarchy, which was this idea that I had accepted that you could not get married and pursue an education, that you had to choose one or the other. And then lastly, this idea that everyday experiences become part of the research inquiry. So for example, although my research really didn't focus on examining the PhD experience, because many of my research collaborators were either working through their PhD or had recently finished their PhD, including myself, a lot of the time was just about talking about our PhD experiences. And this became a central point of theorization. Quetzali specifically was talking about how toxic her program felt and how she didn't feel supported. And so a lot of the time our Platica was about just how do we support each other? What can we do for one another? And so in this way, Quetzali's everyday experiences became part of the research inquiry, right? And what I argue is that Platicas allow for our full selves to be present in the research process, not just what is deemed worthy of examining. They disrupt what Luis Urrieta describes as the dismembering of human bodies that comes through data analysis, where we're disconnecting human emotion or human lives through the research process. And future directions of Platicas in education, by no means is this an exhaustive list, but we do think the following deserves further analysis and discussion. I think we need more examples of how do we conduct Platicas, again, to better understand their structure, their fluidity, the messiness that can all kind of live in just one Platica. The role of humor, chisme, language, for example, the code switching, the Spanglish bilingualism that can emerge in Platicas. And then lastly, I think the pedagogy of Platicas. I think here I'm speaking to my teachers, my educators, my practitioners. As some of you talked about in the chat, right? You're doing Platicas with your students, with your community. We want to document that, right? How are you using Platicas with youth, with community members, and what's other spaces as well? So I just want to put in a quick plug. We are working on a special issue with the International Journal of Qualitative Studies in Education, and we are about to wrap up that call for papers, and it'll be going out at the end of this month. And so I want to encourage folks that perhaps are using Platicas or have used Platicas to consider submitting an article for the special issue. I'm going to do one more thing. I'm going to actually drop one more link in the chat. If you know, like you are interested in getting this call, you can put your name into this Google sheet and I will personally email you the call when it is ready. Like I said, our goal is to have it out in the public by the end of this March. But that's it, folks. I think, let me just make sure. I do have one more slide and I do want to actually show it. It's my favorite slide. Yeah, so thank you. And I just also want to acknowledge all the mother scholars. As I said, I am a mom and it's been tough to mother and have this full-time job as well. So I just want to acknowledge the mothers and the caretakers. This is my email. You can reach out to me, but I'm happy to now make some time for some questions.
Thank you, Professor. We do have about 12 minutes for questions. We have 12 minutes. That's how long we have we have interpreters. So we'll close at the end of 12 minutes. Just a quick reminder to make sure we're completely accessible. When you talk, if you could please turn your video on so that the interpreters could see your face and unmute. And then when you're done, please remute and turn your video off. Thank you. I turn it back over now.
Do you want me to call? I see Kate's hand.
Thank you so much. Okay, sorry. Thank you so much, Dr. Flores. I am very excited to learn about this. And my question was about the special issue of the journal. Is it like only this month that it's coming out, the end of this month?
So we are actually putting a call for papers. So it probably will not be out until 2022. But we would like to open it up to get, because again, I know folks are doing this work and I think this is our effort to continue developing this work. So we're opening it up for submissions.
Thank you.
For sure. I see Amanda or Amanda's hand.
Hi, thank you so much again for your work. My question is, what are some recommendations that you can share in regards to facilitating Platicas virtually?
Thank you for that question, Amanda, because we presented this work in a research apprentice course. And one of the audience members, I think it was Cindy, brought up the fact, right, that because of this new reality, she's conducting Platicas virtually. I know I see my mentee, Maria, who's also doing Platicas and is doing them via, I was gonna say Zoom, via Zoom. And I don't know, I am actually also in the process of conducting Platicas with Chicana Latina faculty who are mothers. And I can tell you it's very different. I think, especially because I'm working with parents, sometimes it's like they're on the phone and the camera's off. So I don't even have a visual of their face. I had my last Platica with a mother, she started crying. Right. And that was really hard to navigate because I'm in a different place. I can't even like be there present and hold space, but we took an opportunity to kind of just sit with the emotions. I mean, in terms of recommendations, I think it helps to just acknowledge, I think, that this looks different, to be very honest. I think part of, again, a Platica methodology is the vulnerability piece, right? And so I've been starting my Platicas with Latina faculty, just being very honest, like I'm using a Platica methodology, but these are some of the challenges because we're doing it virtually. But we're just going to roll with it. But I'm being vulnerable, right? That I don't have it quite figured out how it's going to work out in this virtual format. And I think that is part of a Platica methodology. It's sharing these vulnerabilities and just being honest with your collaborators that you're trying to figure it out. Obviously, I think having your camera on helps, but again, I also completely fully understand that that's a personal choice. Like for some of the mujeres that I'm working with who are mothers, they're on the phone navigating caretaking. And so they don't have their camera on, but we make it work. And I think so remaining flexible. I have questions that I come in with, but I share them in advance with them and I let them know, these are questions, we don't have to go in this order. We can start wherever you're at. And 90% of the time, we're not following that transcript, but the Platica is addressing the questions in a more organic way. Whereas I've had other experiences where the faculty member, being the faculty that we are, will be like, I looked at the questions, let's start with this question. So I also I'm open, right? If they want to go literally question by question, we'll go question by question, or if we just want to talk about it. I think as mothers, as faculty, as mother scholars right now, we're carrying a lot. And so sometimes it's just like release. But yeah, I would say flexibility, sharing, if you have an outline or question, sharing those in advance, and being honest, being vulnerable that this is a new paradigm and we're all trying to figure it out, and just remaining flexible, I would say. I hope that helps. I think I see Carla's hand and then Alonso.
Hi, Alma. It's been a long time since Dr. Flores rack. I just wanted to say hi. My first comment is that thank you so much for doing this. It is so generous of you, especially as a mom and dealing with a lot. I felt there was a spirit of generosity in your presentation. And I do. I've done research in community-based participatory research working with trans Latinas, and we designed a survey where they asked me, where I said, what do you want to be asked? And they gave me questions. I said, this is what we want to be asked. And then I asked them. So it's different from Platicas, but they guided the research. And I saw a connection. I want something more personal. And so I'm so excited about Platicas, and I want to take it over because in so many ways, we have something similar besides the survey. And what I wanted to comment and ask you about too is the piece about healing. And so what I noticed, well, I was taking some notes, but I noticed that because you're so open and vulnerable in the plática, right? And you say, this happened to me, and then it opens up a space to maybe open an old wound or a story, a narrative that you've been carrying. You put it on the table, and they said, oh yeah, I have the same, story or very similar. And I think it's emotionally, your research is academically rigorous and it's emotionally challenging because you open this story up and then they provide something. So it's rewarding and healing. But I also wanted to ask you, if you think about the healing, not just as as a person who may have experienced this, but also as a researcher. And I'll tell you why. When I did my research with trans Latinas, and after I put the data together, when they answer the questions that they wanted to be asked, I said at one line in my dissertation, and I said, there was nothing in the findings that they didn't already know.
Yeah.
Right. So I thought that, so my advisor underlined it, and then Torres was like, yes. And it was because they wanted to make this visible. And so they've been carrying these wounds about different forms of structural violence. And so I wanted to ask you if in your own research or in your call for papers, you would talk about healing as sort of like that colonial way of knowing, like healing for yourself as like, what does it mean to be an academic or a researcher? And also for the community, like, what does it mean for them to produce knowledge? Because I felt that it was healing, that none of the things that emerge are things that they didn't know. They're things that they knew really well. And so that's kind of what I wanted to ask you about, healing from this, the pain of colonial ways of knowing.
Yeah, thank you, Carla, for all of that. I really appreciate that. Absolutely. I think for the special issue, we're looking for conceptual pieces, empirical pieces. We're open because, as I mentioned, this work is emerging, and so it's we really just want to provide scholars with more of these tools to do this work, because I know there are folks that are doing this work already, but perhaps are not naming it or are not calling it that quite yet. And how powerful would it be to have, again, these pieces to kind of rely on. Yeah, I think for me, I'll share the reason why I became interested in Platicas is I was interviewing immigrant mothers. And so the idea of an interview made immigrants, speaking as an immigrant myself, nervous. Like for me, it's like crossing the border and being questioned, how long were you? And so it brings back like these very painful memories for me. And so I knew an interview was not the right approach to engage immigrant mothers with.
Yeah.
And that's when I began to kind of have these conversations with Dr. Delgado Bernal, because they were doing some of this work already. And I liked, it's very different than to say, vamos a platicar, right? Mm-hmm. Then like, voy a entrevistar, I'm going to interview you.
Mm-hmm.
It opened up, just the change, right? In their demeanor, it was different. A lot of the mothers were nervous, right? And I'm like, no, nomás vamos a platicar. We're just gonna talk about your daughter. Like, what parent doesn't like to talk about their kid? Yeah. And so I think it's healing in the sense of like really challenging these colonial ways of doing research that have been so ingrained in academia. Mm-hmm. And also challenging these ideas of, again, of neutrality or objectivity. And for me, I'm just grateful again for the work of Chicana Latina feminist scholars, queer scholars that have been doing this work. So I can be like, this work is legitimate, right? Yeah, I'm not sure if that answered your question, Carla.
No, I think it definitely does. It adds more context, and it's like it is part of the healing. Like I'm like, yes, this is this feels good. So thank you so much, and I'm so proud of the work that you're doing.
Thank you, Carla.
Bye.